Okay, guys, so now we're going to start talking about simple machines and energy and how energy is related to simple machines. And more importantly, how simple machines can make energy more efficient and easier to use. We're also going to introduce some new vocabulary words. We're going to introduce the six simple machines that we're going to be talking about, and we're also going to be talking about something called work. All of you may think you know what work is, but the definition for work is a lot more complicated than you might think. So that is actually what we're going to start off talking about. So let's go ahead and get started. Pull up our PowerPoint from the beginning. Okay. Work is when you apply a force to move or change something. So work is applying a force to move or change something. A force is, as you know, a push or a pull, and work is measured in joules. Okay, so we are going to measure work in something called joules. We also measure energy in this unit called joules. Okay, so work is applying a force to move or change something. So work is when you take a push or a pull, and that push or a pull, that force, moves an object or changes something, which is common sense. It's exactly what we've been talking about so far. Alrighty, so moving on. That seems pretty easy. Alrighty. Work can be observed in everyday life. So, for example, a woman performs work when she pushes a stroller. Because she's moving the stroller, she's changing where the stroller goes. A student performs work when he lifts his books to put them on a shelf. Okay, he's lifting the books, he's changing the position of the books, so he's performing work. A man performs work when he pulls a cart. He's changing the position of the cart, so therefore he is performing work. Okay, so those are a few examples. So if you do not change something, if you don't change the position of something, if you are not applying a force, then it is not work. Okay, so in order to perform work, you have to be applying a force, which in turn changes the position of something. It changes the shape, it changes the position, the direction. You guys know this because we talked about it last unit. It was on your last test, so it ought to be fairly self-explanatory. Alrighty, moving on. Okay, work and energy, they are related. Okay, energy, like I said, is the ability to do work. So if work is when you move or use a force to change or move something, and energy is the ability to do work, then energy is what you have to put in order to get work accomplished. Okay, energy, like work, is measured in joules. Okay, only objects with energy can perform work. Okay, because energy is the ability to do work. So only objects that contain energy can perform work. An object uses energy to apply a force and thus perform work. So energy is like currency. In order to perform work, an object has to spend energy. Okay, it's like money. Alrighty, in order for an object to move, in order for an object to change something, it has to spend energy in order to perform it. Okay, alrighty. So for example, in order to do 100 joules of work, the person has to spend 100 joules of energy. In order to do 200 joules of work, the person has to spend 200 joules of energy. Okay, makes sense. Alrighty, ask questions if you don't understand it. I will be more than happy to answer them, okay? Alrighty, moving on. Okay, simple machines. Alrighty, simple machines make it easier to perform work. They make work easier. Okay, they can make work easier in 4 different ways. Okay, so if we go down to the bullet points, a simple machine can increase the force applied. Okay, without increasing the amount of work that's being done. So they can increase the amount of force that's being applied to an object so that you don't have to do that. Okay, a simple machine can change the direction of the force. They can change the distance or the speed of the force, and they can also transfer force from one place to another. Okay, so those are the 4 ways that simple machines make work easier. They can increase the force, change the direction of the force, change the distance or speed of the force, and transfer the force from one place to another. Alright, simple machines do not change the amount of work being done. They simply reduce the amount of effort that you have to use in order to perform it. Okay, so think about like, let me see, like a wheelbarrow. Okay, wheelbarrows they lift things. They make it so you don't have to carry things from one place to another. Okay, if you've ever carried wood from one place to another by yourself without the help of a wheelbarrow, you know it's pretty hard work. Okay, but when you put the wood in that wheelbarrow, it doesn't seem like you're using that much energy to do it. Okay, you don't have to expend as much force as you would have when you were carrying the wood by yourself. So makes it a little bit easier. Alrighty, so simple machines make work easier. They make it easier to perform work. Okay? Alrighty. Mechanical advantage. When you use a simple machine, okay, you have two types of forces, an input force and an output force. Okay? Simple machines make it easier for you to change the input force, which in turn changes the output force. So when you put in an input force, it might increase the output force, which makes it easier for you to do a certain amount of work. So when you lift, or when you sweep, okay, say when you sweep, use the example of the broom off to the side. So the input force that you put in, you don't have to put in as much input force, but you get out a greater result. You get more output force out of it. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So you don't have to put in as much force and you're getting more out of it. Okay? So the input force causes the machine to perform work. The work performed, okay, gives you the result, which is the output force. So a simple machine amplifies the input force, which in turn gives you a greater output force. Alrighty? And that gives you increased mechanical advantage. Alrighty, there are 6 types of simple machines. There's an inclined plane, a wedge, a screw, the wheel and axle, a lever, and a pulley. Okay? So those are the 6 types of simple machines that we're going to be discussing. Alrighty, first up is an inclined plane. Okay, an inclined plane is a board or any type of flat surface that's set at an angle. Okay, so the board or other flat surface that is set at an angle. The inclined plane makes it easier to raise an object. Okay, so the force needed to push the object up an inclined plane is less than the force that's needed to lift the object. So if you actually tried to lift an object, it would be a lot harder to actually lift it than it would to just push it up an inclined plane. A great example of this would be the pyramids. The Egyptians actually used a series of inclined planes, okay, to set the blocks of the pyramids in place. Those blocks were huge, way too heavy for any person to lift on their own. But with the use of inclined planes, they used those inclined planes to set the blocks in place and to build the humongous structures that you have called pyramids. Okay? So although you apply less force to raise the object using an inclined plane, you also increase the distance you have to move the object. So although you're using less force, you have to increase the distance. So there's a trade-off. Okay, so although you apply less force, you still have to increase the distance. So it's a trade-off of sorts. Okay, so that is an inclined plane. They are really useful in helping raise an object. And all it is a flat surface that's been raised at an angle. That's all it is. All right, a wedge. So a wedge looks like 2 inclined planes that are stacked back to back. A great example of a wedge would be an axe. Okay, and they are used to split objects. Kind of like when you want to split wood, you use an axe. And if you look at the tip of the axe, okay, it looks like it's 2 inclined planes set together. It looks like a V, okay, and that is used to split the object. Alrighty. A wedge changes the direction of the force. So when the person uses a wedge, he applies a downward force, and in turn the wedge applies a horizontal force in order to split the object. So when you hit down with an axe, right, the person is applying a downward force. So when you use the axe, you're swinging it downward. When it hits the wood, okay, the tip of the wedge is making that force go outward horizontally, and that is what splits the wood in half. Alrighty? Okay, next is a screw. All a screw is is an inclined plane that's wrapped around a flat object or a middle object. Okay? All it is an inclined plane that's wrapped around a middle object. And that creates twists, or what you would call threads. Okay? A screw is used to connect objects together. Makes perfect sense, right? If you're screwing two things together, you're connecting them together. All right? And what happens here is when you apply a rotational force, so when you use a screwdriver to apply a rotational force to a screw, the screw turns and is driven into the object. Okay, so it decreases the amount of force you have to have in order to put the two objects together. Okay, but you have to rotate the screw a lot more times than you would any other way. So it decreases the amount of force, but the distance is increased. So you have to screw the screw a lot more times than you would any other way. Okay, you have to rotate the screw more times in order to drive it into an object. Okay, the more threads on the screw, the less force you have to have. But the distance is increased, so you have to rotate it more times. Alrighty, so a screw is an inclined plane that's wrapped around a flat or middle object. Alright, and then the screw is used to connect two things together. Alright, wheel and axle. The wheel and axle is a really, really simple machine. Okay, and it's a wheel on a rod. Okay, that's all it is. It's a wheel that has a metal rod or any type of rod going through the middle of it. Okay, it's used to lift or to move objects. Okay, the wheel and the axle rotate together, and the force that is applied to the wheel makes the axle turn. Okay, if the force is applied to the axle, then the wheel turns. So that way they turn together. Okay, the bigger the wheel, okay, the easier it is to use. The smaller the wheel, the harder it is to use. Alrighty? And it's used to move things from place to place. You guys know this. Your cars have wheels and axles on them. Okay? What are your cars used for? They're used to take you from place to place. Okay? So the wheel and axle is used to move objects from place to place. Alrighty, a lever. A lever is a board or a bar that sits on a fixed point called a fulcrum. Alrighty, and then the fulcrum pivots is this place in the middle that is used. So the lever, the bar in the middle, can pivot or rotate around it. Okay, and the lever makes it easier to raise and lower objects. Think about a seesaw. Okay, you've got this point in the middle called the fulcrum, and then you've got a bar that goes across that. Okay, that's the seesaw part. You know that it is a lot easier, okay, when you have two people sitting on either side of it, it's a lot easier to raise that person up than it is to on a seesaw than it is to actually try to pick that person up. You can pick up a really fat person on a seesaw a whole lot better than you can actually pick them up in person. It is a lot easier to do that on a seesaw than it is any other time. Okay? Makes perfect sense to me. I don't know if it makes any more sense to you guys, but hopefully it will. Okay? The reason the lever is able to do that is because it changes the direction of the force. You are applying a downward force while the lever applies the upward force, raising whatever you need to get up in the air up. Okay? It makes it easier to lift and to lower objects. That is the point of the lever. Okay, so two words you need to know, the word lever and the word fulcrum. Okay, the fulcrum is the fixed point that the board or the bar sits on. Okay, that is the fulcrum. It is the point about which the lever rotates or pivots. Okay, it's the fixed point in the middle that the board or the bar sits on. Okay, that is the fulcrum. Alrighty, a pulley. A pulley is a wheel that has a groove and an outside edge, and then it has a rope or a belt that sits around it. Okay? So the pulley is a wheel or a bar with a groove, and then it has a rope or a belt that sits inside of it. And then when you apply the downward force, the pulley applies the upward force, and the object or whatever that you need to lift up is lift upwards. Okay, so the pulley makes work easier by changing the direction of the force and decreasing the amount of force you need to raise the object. Okay, so we were talking about a pulley. And I just really quickly want to review what that was, just in case you guys didn't check it, because it was close to the end of that first video. Okay, so a pulley is a wheel. So think about the wheel and axle. Okay, the pulley is a wheel with a groove, and then it has an outside edge. And then inside that groove, you can have a rope or a belt. All right, and if you think about a pulley, I mean, what do you think pulleys are used for? When you think about a pulley, what do you think? You think about something that can be used to raise or lower an object. Okay, so the whole point of this is if you pull down on the pulley, the object that is attached to the other end of the rope is going to be lifted up. So the pulley makes it easier to perform work by changing the direction that the force is applied, right? So if you pull down, the other object is being pulled up the other side. Okay, so the pulley makes work easier in this case by changing the direction of the force. Alrighty, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, and then compound machines. So we just went over those simple machines. Alright, so now think about a compound machine. When you think about the word compound, what do you think? Okay, you think about things that are, let me think, they're more than one. Okay, so when I think about a compound fraction, okay, you've got more than one. Okay, so a compound machine then consists of two or more simple machines that work together. So a compound machine is more than one simple machine that is put together to perform a common function. Okay, so generally compound machines perform more complex functions than simple machines. Okay, for example, a stapler is actually a lever, which is the stapler part, okay, and then a wedge, which is the staple. Okay, it's actually kind of cool. Alrighty, a wheelbarrow is actually a lever, okay, and then a wheel and axle. Okay, so if we look here, all right, this is the lever part. The wheel would be your fulcrum. Okay, this is the lever part. And then you have your wheel and axle. So the lever makes it easier for you to change the direction of the force by lifting up. Okay, it makes it easier for you to lift something that's in the wheelbarrow. And then the wheel and axle makes it a lot easier for you to move it. Okay, so that is a wheelbarrow is actually a compound machine. A stapler is actually a compound machine. Some other compound machines can be a screwdriver, okay, a can opener, and then a lawnmower. So let's go over what types of simple machines are actually in those. Okay, so obviously when you have a screwdriver, you're obviously going to have a screw. Okay, because a screwdriver is used to drill in screws. Okay, a wedge and a wheel and axle. The wheel and axle is the rotating part. Okay, the wedge, okay, is this part right here. It's when you're using that to wedge it in between two pieces of wood. Alrighty, can opener, the lever, which is this part, and it's got a fulcrum down here. Okay, the wedge right here, which is the point of the wheel and axle. Alrighty, and then here, your lawnmower would be the lever, okay, up here. A wedge, which would be the blade, okay, that cuts off the grass. And then a wheel and axle. Ta-da! Okay, so lots of things that you use on an everyday basis are actually compound machines. Kind of cool, right? Let me think. Some other example of compound machines. Let me see. Oh, well, here are some examples of things that you wouldn't normally think of being simple machines. What about a doorknob? Okay, that's actually a wheel and axle. A screwdriver, that's actually a wheel and axle. Let me see. A bicycle is another example of a compound machine. You've got a wheel and axle, okay? You've got screws that hold the actual parts of the bike together. And then you actually have a lever, which would be the brakes on the bike. So, kind of nifty. Alrighty? And if I'm not mistaken, yep, that is the end of our video for this part.